Dr. Claire Merritt stood in the middle of the emergency wing hallway. Her finger pointed directly at Ryan Calloway's face. Her voice cut through the air sharp and certain, loud enough for every nurse, every resident, every orderly within 30 feet to hear. "You're just a nurse. Know your place." The words landed like a verdict. No one moved. No one spoke. Ryan stood perfectly still, eyes cast downward, clipboard pressed against his chest, absorbing every syllable in silence. Then came the sound. A low, thunderous roar that shook the windows and stilled the entire floor. A Navy helicopter descended onto the parking lot outside, rotors splitting the morning air. A uniformed officer stepped out, metals gleaming across his chest, and walked straight through the automatic doors. Nobody in that hallway knew who Ryan Calloway really was. They were about to find out. The morning had started the way it always did. Ryan set his alarm for 5:45. Not because he needed the extra time, but because Lily did. His daughter was 7 years old and had very strong opinions about which socks matched which shoes, a negotiation that could consume a full 12 minutes if left unmanaged. He stood at the kitchen counter pouring coffee into a thermos, listening to her debate herself in the next room. The sound of it made him smile in the quiet way men smile when no one is watching. He dropped her at Garfield Elementary by 7:15. At the curb, Lily turned back and looked up at him, with the particular seriousness only a 7-year-old can manufacture. "Dad," she said, "are you a hero?" He crouched down. "Why do you ask that?" She shrugged. "Because you help people, and heroes help people." He said, "I'm just someone who shows up. That's all." She hugged him once, hard, and ran through the gate without looking back. Ryan stood at the curb 3 seconds longer than necessary. Then he drove to Street Andover Medical Center and clocked in for his shift. The emergency department at Street Andover was not a forgiving place in the morning. It moved fast and loud and had very little patience for people who couldn't keep up. Ryan had worked the department for 4 years, long enough to know where every supply cart lived, long enough to know which physicians ran hot and which ran cold, long enough to know that Chloe Vance, the charge nurse, had made it a quiet hobby to remind him that he did not quite belong there. She was standing near the nursing station when he arrived, talking in a low voice to a newer technician named Marcus. They both looked up when Ryan passed. Neither said good morning. He heard Chloe say something after he turned the corner, too quiet to catch the words but not quiet enough to miss the tone. He had stopped reacting to it a long time ago. Reactions cost energy, and energy in an emergency department was a finite resource. He checked the board, pulled his first 2 patients, and got to work. The first patient was a 63-year-old man with chest tightness and diaphoresis. Ryan ran the strip, flagged it to Dr. Halstead, and had 2 large-bore IVs placed and nitroglycerin drawn before Halstead finished reviewing the EKG. Halstead noticed, "Fine $40. His jaw tightened in the way it always did when the nursing staff demonstrated competence that wasn't specifically requested. He said nothing and moved on. The second patient was a young woman with a laceration on her forearm, frightened and trying not to show it. Ryan talked to her while he irrigated the wound, low and steady, the kind of voice that didn't call attention to itself. By the time he had her draped and prepped, she had stopped shaking. She asked how long he had been a nurse. He said 4 years at this hospital. She said he seemed like he'd been doing it forever. He said some days it felt that way. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that happened 40 times a day in emergency departments across the country, unremarkable and unrecorded and invisible to anyone who didn't understand what it cost to do well. Ryan understood, in the way only certain people understand it. Claire Merritt arrived on her morning rounds at 8:40. She moved through the department with the efficiency of someone who had learned early that presence communicated authority more reliably than volume. When she passed Ryan's station, she paused, watched him work for 15 seconds without speaking, then turned to Chloe and said in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough, "Nurses here need to know their limits." She walked on. Ryan did not look up. The trauma came in at 1:17. Male, early 30s, construction worker, rollover on I-25, packaged and moving but trending badly in multiple directions at once. Heart rate climbing, blood pressure dropping, breath sounds diminished on the right. Ryan was the first nurse to the bay. He ran his hands over the patient with systematic purpose, reading the body the way other people read a page of text, Not rushing, not skipping steps, finding what was there rather than what he expected to find. Halstead came in 2 minutes behind him. He assessed the vitals, reviewed the paramedic report, and ordered a chest x-ray and bilateral large-bore IVs, standard protocol. Correct for a significant percentage of cases presenting with these numbers. Not this case. Ryan recognized it in the percussion note over the right chest wall, in the tracheal deviation that was subtle enough to miss if you were watching a monitor instead of a patient. Tension pneumothorax, air trapped in building, the mediastinum beginning to shift. The x-ray they had ordered would take time the patient did not have. He said it clearly. Doctor, Halstead, I think we're looking at a tension pneumo. The trachea is deviated, breath sounds on the right are absent, and his pressure is continuing to fall. Halstead cut him off without turning. I've assessed the patient, Calloway. Thank you. Ryan stopped. He looked at the patient. The systolic was 82. The saturation was dropping in real time on the monitor above the bed. Halstead stepped to the far side of the bay to take a phone call. His back was turned. Ryan picked up a 14-gauge needle. He found the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line on the right, confirmed his landmarks, and decompressed the chest. The rush of air was immediate and audible. The blood pressure began climbing within 60 seconds. The saturation followed. By the time Halstead turned back around, the patient's numbers were moving in the right direction, and color had begun returning to his face. The room was very quiet. Halstead looked at the needle still in the field. He looked at Ryan. He held that look for 3 full seconds. Then he began directing the rest of the team as though the previous 90 seconds had not occurred, his voice measured and unhurried, the performance of a man who had decided not to acknowledge what he had just walked back into. Ryan pulled off his gloves and went to document his intervention. He did not see Claire Merritt in the doorway. She had arrived to check on the incoming status and had caught the entire sequence from beginning to end. Then she walked away without speaking and went directly to the HR office. She pulled Ryan Calloway's personnel file. The document was thinner than she expected. 4 years of performance evaluations at Street Andover, all rated competent to excellent. Prior employment before the hospital. A single line. 10 years. Federal service. The employer field was blank. The supervisor contact field was blank. There was a notation in the upper corner of the document she had not encountered on any other personnel file in 11 years of practicing medicine. She picked up the phone and called the HR director. The HR director listened to her question. Then she said, Dr. Merritt, that file carries a security designation. I am not authorized to discuss the prior employment history, and neither is anyone else at this institution. I'd strongly advise against submitting a formal records request on it as well. Claire set the phone down carefully. She looked out the window at the ordinary afternoon below. Whatever she had expected when she opened that file, it was not that. She returned to the department. There were patients waiting, and she was the person responsible for them. The confrontation happened the following afternoon, and it happened in the open. Ryan was returning from the supply room when Claire stepped into the main corridor directly ahead of him. She had chosen the location deliberately or by instinct, the central hallway of the emergency wing, visible from the nursing station, from 2 bay doorways, from the resident work area along the south wall. Chloe was at the station. 2 residents were charting nearby. A young male nurse named Derek stood near the far end of the corridor with a chart in his hand, pretending to read it. Claire did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her voice in that register was its own kind of force, controlled and precise, and carrying the particular weight of institutional authority, combined with the absolute certainty that she was correct. Ryan Calloway, she said, what you did in that trauma bay was outside the scope of your role. You performed an invasive procedure without a physician order, without documented authorization, and without notifying the attending before you acted. If that patient had coded on the table, if anything at all had gone wrong, this hospital could not have protected you, and it should not have had to. She stepped closer. Her finger came up, pointing directly at his face, closing whatever distance remained between the statement and the man she was directing it at. You are a nurse. You are here to support this clinical team, not to override it. You're just a nurse. Know your place. The hallway was completely still. Ryan stood with the clipboard against his chest and his eyes lowered, Not in shame, but in the particular stillness of a man who has stood in rooms louder and more dangerous than this, and learned that not every force requires a counterforce. He let her finish. He let the silence hold for one full second. Then he looked up and met her eyes directly. His voice was quiet. "The patient is alive, Dr. Merritt." He stepped around her and walked down the hallway. His pace did not change. He did not look back. Chloe watched him go with the expression of someone whose long-held position had just been officially endorsed. The two residents exchanged a glance and looked back at their charts. Derek, at the far end of the corridor, looked at the floor where Ryan had been standing, then in the direction Ryan had gone. He said nothing. He did not move for a moment. There was something in his face that was not quite admiration and not quite confusion, but existed in the space between those two things, and it stayed there for a moment longer than the situation called for. That evening, Ryan picked up Lily from her after-school program at 5:30. She talked about her day for the entire drive home, which was a form of generosity he never took for granted. At the kitchen table after dinner, while he washed the dishes, she sat with her sketchbook and a box of crayons. When he came around to look, she had drawn a figure in blue, wearing what appeared to be a cape made from a stethoscope. She had written "Dad" in careful letters across the top. He stood looking at it for longer than she expected, which made her look up. He said it was perfect. Then he sat beside her and asked if she wanted to hear a story. She climbed into his lap and said yes, and he told her one about a man who lived in a city and helped people and came home at the end of every day, and she was asleep before it was over. He carried her to bed and came back and sat alone at the kitchen table for a while, with the drawing in front of him and the house quiet around him. The next morning brought Eleanor Walsh, 67 years old, widowed 4 months prior, brought in by her neighbor after 2 days of chest tightness and shortness of breath. The EKG was clean. The troponin levels were negative. The chest X-ray showed nothing structural. What the test could not quantify was the grief that had been residing in Eleanor Walsh's chest since February, settling into the space her husband of 41 years had left behind. She had stopped sleeping past 4 in the morning. She had stopped making coffee for 2 people and had not yet learned how to make it for 1. Ryan was assigned to her bay. He completed the assessment, documented the results, relayed everything to the attending, and confirmed the discharge plan. Then he pulled a chair to the side of her bed and sat down. She looked at him with the cautious expression of someone who had spent 2 days being efficiently processed. She asked if something was wrong with her results. He said the results were fine. He said he had a few minutes, and she seemed like she could use some company. She looked at him for a moment. Then something loosened in her face, and she began to talk. She talked about Gerald, her husband, who had died of a stroke in February, who had made her coffee every morning without being asked, who had been inexplicably afraid of birds but would never admit it to anyone, not once in 41 years. She talked about the house being too quiet now. She talked about waking at 4 in the morning, with nowhere to put her attention, no sound in the kitchen, no voice anywhere in the rooms, just the particular silence of a space that had been built around 2 people and now held only 1. Ryan listened. He asked questions at the right moments. He told her about Lily and her rock collection in Denver in the winter. He said he had chosen nursing because the people who showed up and stayed were the ones that mattered most. He said, "Doctors come and go. Nurses stay." Eleanor Walsh smiled for the first time since she had come through the emergency department doors. She said, "You remind me of my Gerald. Not in how you look, in how you listen." Ryan said he took that as a compliment. She said he was right to. Neither of them knew that Claire Merritt had stopped outside the bay. She had come by on her afternoon rounds, tablet in hand, and had heard Ryan's voice through the open door, low and unhurried in the way it was when he was talking to a patient rather than a colleague. She had stopped walking. She stood outside the doorway for the better part of the conversation, listening to things she had not expected to hear from a man she thought she had already understood. When she finally moved on, she walked more slowly than usual down the corridor toward the next bay. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She read the message. Halstead had filed a formal complaint with the board. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Breach of clinical protocol. Potential liability exposure. He had attached a summary and was requesting her countersignature before the close of business. She stopped walking. She read it twice. She reached into her pocket and found her pen. She held it in her hand. She thought about the file with the blank fields and the security designation. She thought about 90 seconds in the trauma bay that had moved a patient's oxygen saturation from 87 to 94. She thought about the voice she had heard through the doorway of Bay 11. She put the pen back in her pocket and kept walking. The formal hearing took place 2 mornings later in the third-floor conference room. Halstead sat at one end of the long table with a printed summary and a copy of the hospital's nursing scope of practice policy. Chloe Vance sat beside him as the named witness. The board liaison, a quiet woman named Patricia, sat with a notepad open and her pen resting on the page. Ryan Calloway sat at the far end of the table, alone. He had no attorney, no representative, nothing in front of him. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his posture entirely still, the way a person sits when they have made peace with the fact that what happens next is out of their hands. Claire sat at the center of the table and opened the proceedings. Halstead presented his account with methodical care. He cited 3 specific provisions of the hospital's clinical governance framework, reading each one aloud before offering his interpretation of how Ryan's actions had violated it. He described the incident sequence in precise detail, and he was not wrong about any of the facts. The facts were not the problem. The problem was the frame around them, the way he arranged those facts into a narrative in which a patient's survival was incidental to the question of who had been in charge of the room. He recommended a 30-day suspension pending a full review of Ryan's nursing certification. He said this was not punitive. He said this was protocol. Chloe corroborated the timeline and added, in a tone she had clearly practiced, that this had not been an isolated pattern. She used the phrase boundary testing twice and the phrase chain of command once. When she finished, she folded her hands in front of her with the expression of a woman who had waited a long time to be in this room saying these things. Claire listened to all of it without interrupting. She took notes. She did not look at Ryan while Halstead and Chloe were speaking. When Halstead finished, she turned to the far end of the table and asked Ryan if he wished to respond. Ryan stood. The room looked at him. He looked at Claire directly, not at Halstead, not at Chloe, not at Patricia and her notepad. He looked at Claire and he said, "The patient is alive. I'll accept whatever comes next." Then he sat back down. The room was silent for several seconds. Patricia had her pen poised above the notepad. She did not write anything. Claire looked at her notes. Then she looked at Halstead. Then she said, "I am not prepared to issue a ruling today. On her plays abound, Obera Palament's hen. I am requesting a 48-hour extension to review the incident documentation in full before any decision is entered into the record." Halstead's composure held, but only by a margin. He said the documentation was already in front of her and that she had had 2 days to review it. He said delays served no clinical or administrative purpose. He said the institution's position on unauthorized nursing interventions needed to be established clearly and quickly, and that waiting communicated tolerance for the kind of behavior they were all sitting in this room to address. Claire said, 48 hours, Dr. Halstead. The hearing is adjourned. There was nothing more he could do. The room emptied. Ryan was the last one through the door. He did not look at Claire as he passed. She did not call after him. When the room was empty, she sat alone at the long table. In front of her was Halstead's one-page summary with the signature line still blank at the bottom. She thought about the 82 systolic on the monitor. She thought about the rush of air when the needle found the right space. She thought about 90 seconds and what those 90 seconds had been worth. She looked at the signature line for a long time. Then she closed the folder and walked back to the department. She had not signed it. The following morning began without incident. Ryan arrived at 6:50, checked the overnight board, took his first patient, and moved through the opening of the shift the way he always did, efficiently and without commentary. The department ran its usual rhythm around him. At 8:22, the windows began to vibrate. The sound was different from the medevac. Everyone who worked in the department knew the medevac, knew its particular pitch and cadence, the way it announced itself from the roof and then went quiet. This sound came from the parking lot. It was heavier, and it did not go quiet when it should have. People stopped what they were doing. A nurse near the east windows looked out and said something under her breath. In the far end of the visitor parking lot, a gray Navy helicopter was settling onto the asphalt. Its rotors were still turning at speed, the downwash pressing flat the thin strip of ornamental grass at the edge of the lot and sending paper cups skittering across the pavement. 2 men in uniform stepped out before the rotors had fully slowed. They walked toward the building with the deliberate pace of people who do not hurry because they do not need to. They came through the automatic doors without stopping at the front desk. The taller of the two moved with the unhurried authority of someone accustomed to entering rooms that were not ready for him. He looked at the nearest staff member and said, "Ryan Calloway, is he on shift today?" The department went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something enters that does not belong to the ordinary grammar of the space. Halstead appeared from a side corridor. He looked at the two men, assessed their uniforms, their posture, the complete absence of explanation or apology in how they occupied the room, and asked who they were and what this was about. The taller man reached into his breast pocket and produced a credential wallet. He held it open and forward. Joint Special Operations Command. His name was Commander Jake Reyes, and his voice carried the particular flatness of someone accustomed to saying things exactly once. He looked at Halstead and said, "We need Calloway. Right now." Halstead looked at the credentials. He looked at Reyes. He looked around the room. The room did not offer him anything useful. Ryan came out of Bay 4 with a chart in his hand, pulling off a glove with the other hand. He saw Reyes and stopped walking. Reyes saw him. What passed between them in the 3 seconds that followed was not a greeting and not a briefing and not anything that had a clean name. It was the recognition of two people who had been in the same places at the same times and had agreed, without ever saying so explicitly, to trust each other with things that could not be explained to anyone who had not also been there. Ryan looked at Claire, who was standing near the nursing station. He said, "I need 10 minutes. She nodded. She did not speak. Halstead opened his mouth. Reyes turned his head and looked at him. The look contained no hostility and no warmth and no invitation to continue. He said one word, "Don't." Halstead did not speak. Chloe Vance stood near the nursing station with her arms at her sides. The expression she had been carrying since the hallway confrontation was gone, replaced by something quieter and considerably less certain. Ryan handed his chart to the nearest nurse and walked with Commander Reyes toward the parking lot exit. The automatic doors opened. The doors closed behind them. No one in the department spoke for a long moment. Then slowly, carefully, like a room finding its footing after the floor has shifted, people returned to what they had been doing. But the department that resumed its work was not the same department that had existed 9 minutes earlier, and everyone in it understood that without needing to articulate it. Claire walked to the window that faced the parking lot. Below, Ryan and Reyes stood near the helicopter, which had powered down to a lower idle. Reyes was talking. Ryan was listening with the particular quality of attention of someone for whom listening had once been operationally critical. He stood with his weight evenly distributed, his arms at his sides, asking a single question when Reyes paused. Reyes answered. Ryan was quiet for a moment, then nodded once. Claire could not hear any of it. She could read the space between them. They did not stand like a superior and a subordinate. They stood like two people who had been through something together that did not translate into the language of a hospital parking lot in Colorado. She thought about the personnel file. She thought about 10 years, federal service, and the blank fields and the security designation that no HR director would discuss. She thought about 90 seconds in a trauma bay and a patient whose blood pressure had climbed back from the edge of no return. She thought about the hearing and the way Ryan had stood and said 7 words and sat back down, and how those 7 words had contained more than everything Halstead had said in 15 minutes. What Reyes was telling Ryan was this. A protocol Ryan had written years ago, in a context that bore no resemblance to the emergency department of Street Andover, had a gap that had gone undetected for too long. It had been identified during a recent operation in conditions Ryan would recognize: the cold, the altitude, the delay between injury and the moment someone could reach the patient, the margin for error that was not a margin at all. Someone had paid for it. The gap was specific and technical, and it lived in the section of the document that addressed thoracic trauma in non-permissive environments, which was the section Ryan knew better than any other because he had written it from memory in a forward operating base in 2012, working from what his hands had already learned. Reyes needed Ryan's understanding of how the body behaved under those conditions. He needed Ryan's thinking on the specific failure point. He needed 72 hours of that thinking, because Ryan was the person who had written the original document and understood every assumption built into it, including the assumptions so obvious to him that he had never thought to write them down, which was precisely where the gap lived. Ryan had served 8 years as an 18 Delta, Special Operations Combat Medic, attached to SEAL Team 6. He had written the thoracic trauma protocol during his last deployment because the existing guidance was inadequate, and people were dying from inadequacies he knew how to correct. The Navy had adopted it. He had not particularly thought about how widely it had spread in the years since. He had left the teams after his wife died and come home to Lily, who was 3 years old and did not understand where her father had been or what her mother's absence meant. He had enrolled in a nursing program and learned to do with a stethoscope and an IV kit what he had once done with a field kit and whatever else was within reach. The work was the same in the ways that mattered. The setting was different in ways that allowed him to come home every night. It was not a return to service. It was not a reassignment. It was the work. Because some work only certain people can do, and the people who can do it do not stop being able to do it simply because they have changed buildings. Ryan looked at the ground for a moment. He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was making a decision he had already made and was simply taking a moment to acknowledge it. Then he looked back at Reyes and said, "Okay." He shook Reyes's hand. A brief handshake, 2 seconds, the grip of two people who had once needed to trust each other completely and had not stopped. Ryan walked back through the automatic doors. He moved through the silence without acknowledging it and stopped in front of Claire. He said, "I'll be back in 3 days. There's a patient in Base 6 who needs a potassium level reviewed before noon, and Derek knows where the backup laryngoscope blades are kept." Claire looked at him. She said, "Okay." He held her gaze for 1 beat past what information alone required. Then he went to get his things, and then he walked back out through the automatic doors. And then the helicopter lifted from the parking lot in a sound that rattled the windows all the way down the east corridor, and then it was gone. Ryan came back on a Thursday morning, 3 days and a few hours after the helicopter had taken him out of the parking lot and into whatever came next. He stopped at Garfield Elementary first. Lily came through the school gate and saw him at the curb and ran the last 20 feet without slowing down. He caught her and held on longer than the moment required, and she let him, which was a grace she extended without knowing she was extending it. She talked about a science project and the particular injustice of being told she could only do it once. He listened to every word and laughed where laughing was required and was glad to be standing in the afternoon cold with his daughter's voice filling the space around him. In the car, she asked where he had been. He said he had gone to help some people. She asked if they were okay now. He said he thought so. She considered this with the gravity of someone who understood that helping people sometimes required leaving, and she seemed to find it acceptable. Then she told him a joke she had learned from a boy named Caleb, which did not quite land, and laughed at it anyway, and he laughed with her because her laugh made other laughter mandatory. At the hospital the next morning, the formal complaint against Ryan Calloway had been withdrawn from the board's consideration. No explanation accompanied the withdrawal, and none was offered. Halstead arrived late and moved through the department without stopping at the nursing station and without making eye contact with anyone he did not have immediate clinical business with. Chloe was at the desk when Ryan came in. She looked up. She looked back down at what she was doing. She did not speak. Ryan logged into the system, checked the board, and started his shift the same way he always did, without ceremony and without commentary. He was in Bay 3 before noon when footsteps stopped outside the curtain. He finished what he was documenting before he looked up. Claire was there. She was not carrying her department chief expression. She was carrying something quieter than that, less certain, more honest. She said, "I owe you an apology, not the institutional kind, a real one. What I said to you in that hallway, the way I said it, in front of all those people, I let assumptions do the work that actual questions should have done. That wasn't fair to you, and I was wrong about the procedure. I knew it before the hearing ended, and I didn't say it fast enough." Ryan looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You held the decision for 48 hours. That was enough." Claire held his gaze. She said, "It shouldn't have taken 48 hours. A pause. Ryan's expression shifted, just slightly, at the corner of his mouth. The real kind of smile, brief and unguarded. The kind that arrives before a person decides whether to let it Claire found herself looking at him the way you look at something that has rearranged itself without your permission, and you are not entirely sure when it happened. She said she needed to get back to rounds. He said, of course. She turned and walked back down the hallway, and for a moment she could not entirely explain why the department felt lighter than it had in a week. 2 days later, she stopped by Eleanor Walsh's room during a follow-up visit. Eleanor was preparing to be discharged and sat on the edge of the bed with her coat already on, her hands folded in her lap, looking like someone who was ready to go home, but not certain what going home would feel like now. They talked about her discharge instructions, her follow-up appointments, the short list of symptoms that should bring her back. Then Claire asked, almost incidentally, whether any of the nursing staff had been particularly helpful during her stay. Eleanor Walsh looked at her for a moment. She said, "There was a nurse named Ryan. She said he sat with her when he did not have to, when no one would have noticed or said anything if he had simply finished his documentation and moved to the next patient. She said he talked to her like a person rather than a case. And she said he told her something she had been turning over in her mind ever since. He told me he used to save people in places no one knew the name of. Now he wants to save people in places where they can go home after." Claire thanked her. She walked back down the hallway more slowly than she had walked in. The following Tuesday, she found Ryan in the cafeteria on his lunch break, sitting alone in the corner with a sandwich and a cup of coffee and the particular stillness of someone who was genuinely resting. She asked if she could sit. He gestured to the chair across from him without looking up, which she found she did not mind. They talked for close to an hour. They talked about Lily and her opinions and her rock collection, which Ryan described with the fond exhaustion of a man who had learned not to ask which rocks were important and simply accepted that all of them were. They talked about Denver in January, which Ryan said was brutal but honest, which Claire said was how she preferred her winters. They talked about emergency medicine and what had drawn each of them to it, and the conversation moved the way conversations move when neither person is performing for the other. Ryan said he had always been most useful in the places where the margin between outcomes was smallest. He said it without drama, the way people state facts about themselves that have been true long enough that they no longer require emphasis. He did not elaborate on what had taught him that. He did not need to, and Claire did not ask, because she had begun to understand that the things Ryan Calloway did not say were not omissions. They were choices, made deliberately by a man who had learned that most things worth knowing could be read in what a person did rather than what they declared. Near the end of the hour, Claire looked across the table and said, "You never wanted anyone to know, did you?" Ryan looked at his coffee, then at her. He said, "I just wanted to do my job." They walked back to the department from different directions. The hallway connecting the cafeteria to the emergency wing was long and had a slight bend that let you see most of its length from either end. Claire reached the department entrance and paused. She looked back down the corridor. Ryan had also stopped. He was also looking back. Neither of them spoke. After a moment, they both turned and continued on. 3 weeks passed. On a Saturday morning, Ryan drove home with Lily from her friend Nora's house. At a red light, she turned to look at him with the same seriousness she had produced at the school curb a month before. "Dad," she said, "are you a hero?" He looked at the light. He looked at her. He took longer than he had the first time. He said, "I think a hero is someone who shows up when things are hard, who stays when it would be easier to go, who tries to leave things a little better than they found them." Lily thought about this. Then she said, "Okay, that's you." The light changed and he drove, and the city moved past the windows in the pale winter light. The following Monday, a new nurse arrived for his first shift. His name was Tyler, and he was 25 years old, and he moved through his assignments with the careful deliberateness of someone trying hard not to make a mistake in a place that would notice. Halstead passed him without acknowledgement. It was not an encouraging beginning. Ryan finished what he was doing and stopped beside the young man. He said, "First shift?" Tyler looked up and said, "Yes." Ryan said, "I'll be right here if you need me. There's no question in this department too small to ask. Don't be afraid to use your voice." Tyler exhaled. It was the exhale of someone who had been holding their breath since 6 in the morning. From the corridor, through the glass partition that faced the main bay, Claire stood with a chart she was not reading. She was watching Ryan with the new nurse, patient and unhurried, making a young man feel visible on a day when that was exactly what he needed. No helicopter today. No one calling his name. Just Ryan Calloway doing exactly what he chose, saving lives, one at a time, in a hospital in Denver that the rest of the world would never think to remember.